Previously on the channel, I've reviewed games that were released on both the Genesis and the Sega CD. And you might think offhand, well, why do that? It's just going to be the same game again, isn't it? Just with the trade-off of better sound, but also having longer loading times. And yeah, it's true that depending on the game and the developer, some titles definitely had more ambitious uses of the multimedia hardware than others. And that is exactly why I review both versions of the game. Because for every game like Lethal Enforcers, where there's unfortunately very little that's different between the two, there's also something like Cliffhanger or Three Ninjas Kick Back out there, which not only have digital video added to the game, but also additional new levels that actually take advantage of the scaling and rotation features available to the Sega CD specifically. Definitely go check out those videos if you're interested in the differences, or lack thereof, between the editions of those games. However, all three of those games mentioned are action titles, with Lethal Enforcers coming from Konami and Cliffhanger and Three Ninjas Kick Back being from Sony ImageSoft before Sony had their own multimedia machine to develop for. Well, what about the sports genre though? I haven't had the chance to compare any of the Sony ImageSoft sports titles based on the ESPN license yet, but I have played and reviewed both the Genesis and Sega CD versions of Bill Walsh College Football. And the results there weren't exactly exciting if you were looking to get the most bang for your buck out of your new $300 Sega CD add-on in 1993. Which leads us to the subject of this week's video, the Sega CD version of FIFA International Soccer. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and just got randomly dropped here due to searching for more information on one of the most corrupt sporting institutions known to man. Hi, my name is Dave and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm out to collect and review not just video games that featured the name brand of a sports organization that honestly thought it was a good idea to have a worldwide soccer tournament in the middle of the desert in a country that prior to the tournament only had one stadium capable of hosting a World Cup game, but also the nearly 1,280 other titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. And yes, to all of you out there that want to complain that 2022 called and they want their Qatar World Cup jokes back, I say to you, there is never a bad time to take the piss out of FIFA. The organization, not the soccer game that I'm reviewing today. Instead, I've actually got a really good feeling about today's review, just based on how things went when I reviewed the Genesis version back in episode 131. Unless something terrible happened, this should at very least be an above average sports title. And that's if the Sega CD version is just the Genesis version all over again, but with better audio, a la Bill Walsh. But from just some other research that I've done, I think there might be a little bit more to this release than that. So let's check it out and see what's actually included here, but first, a look at the package.
Okay, and this is my copy of FIFA International Soccer for the Sega CD. As you can immediately tell by looking at it, this is clearly not one of the best condition copies of a Sega CD title that I have in my library. I'm going to be honest, with this being a sports title and not Championship Soccer 94 or ESPN NBA Hangtime 95, which are both triple-digit games by the way, if you're not aware, I don't care too much about this being in not too nice a condition, as long as it's at least decent, and I think this copy meets that standard. While yes, there are a few stress cracks in the front cover, and for some reason a chunk of the bottom is missing, the hinges are at least intact at the top and bottom, which is probably the biggest issue that these oversized jewel cases face. And believe it or not, I did clean this up a bit before the video. For some reason, a previous owner had put a bunch of scotch tape on the front and the side, almost as if just to keep the case closed, because it certainly wasn't for any kind of repair purposes. Odd to be sure, but at least I was able to get it off without making too much of a mess. If I did decide at some point that I wanted to upgrade this copy for a better one, or if you decide that you want one for yourself, complete copies currently sell for under $20, as it's one of the more common games on the console, but personally, I think this one will suffice for me. As far as the front cover goes, it's got art that's very reminiscent of the Genesis version of the game, just slightly moved around to fit the formatting of the Sega CD, with the traditional blue bar on the side. Regardless of if it was the Genesis or the Sega CD version, I always thought this art was decent, albeit nothing special, with it being pretty common for sports games to feature some sort of real-life picture on the cover. Like many Sega CD titles that were released in the United States, there was not a Japanese release for FIFA. And this isn't too surprising given the differences in the libraries between the two regions, and instead Japan would have to make do with just the Mega Drive port that was released at the same time as the Sega CD version, to coincide with the World Cup in June of 1994. Europe, on the other hand, did get a Sega, or Mega CD version, as it were. However, it looks a bit different, not just with different formatting, but also a different picture, and the game is now titled FIFA International Soccer Championship Edition, seemingly indicating that this game has more content than just the Genesis version. Now, I'm not sure why the same marketing wasn't used for the Sega CD version, but I guess maybe EA thought that US players wouldn't be big enough soccer fans to care about a Championship Edition that wasn't related to Street Fighter II. Flipping over the back, and while there's a few mediocre screenshots, what should really be brought to everyone's attention is the new features to the game. EA leads with, "You've never heard soccer like this before," and then leans into the fact that they were able to use the Sega CD to include better audio to the game. And all I can say is that thank God this was a year for the World Cup pre-Vuvuzelas. And if you don't get that reference, well, you're blessed. Along with the enhanced audio, I'm definitely interested in these two sections, enhanced player animations and new secret game modes. Curious indeed. Opening up the case, and the manual has thankfully held up better than the outside of the package, and is definitely a bit thicker than the traditional Sega CD manual. This, however, lines up with the EA Genesis manuals at the time, which were huge in their own right. The manual fully explains the game, which is nice, but one of the strengths about a game like FIFA is that you really don't need a whole lot of explanation, and thankfully there is a quick start guide right up front to get you charging up the field for a corner in no time. Okay, that's the package. Let's get into FIFA for the Sega CD and see just how much better this version of the game is from the Genesis original. When I first booted up the Sega CD version of FIFA, it had been about 2.5 years since I'd played another game in the FIFA series, going back to that original Genesis version, as I don't play any of the modern installments in the series, or really much of any modern sports game. And that's not because I have a dislike for them, it's more of just a time concern, as usually I'd rather watch sports on TV than play a virtual version that's become ever increasingly more broadcast-like. But over the last 2.5 years, I have played some other soccer titles, namely World Championship Soccer, Pele, and even European Club Soccer. Those all ranged from mediocre at best to pretty good, but honestly, even European Club Soccer and its over 100 teams simply wasn't as fun as FIFA International Soccer for the Genesis, which even all these years later still played fantastic and was good enough for me to give it 3 stars when I reviewed it back in episode 131. Of course, the first thing that people are probably going to ask is, well, what makes this different than that Genesis version? Or maybe, is it worth seeking out this version instead if I already have the Genesis version? Well, Electronic Arts tried to address those questions for potential buyers on the back of the package, and there are a few differences here that I think are worth noting, and then there's also a few that are of lesser importance. I already mentioned the enhanced audio, and I'll get more into that in the sound section later on, but to sum it up, they are not kidding when they say it's enhanced, as this is definitely a selling point if you care about audio in your games at all. The next big change is the addition of more teams. In the Genesis version of FIFA, the game consisted of 48 national teams and then a Super Electronic Arts team. For the Sega CD version, the Super EA team has been removed, but instead 10 more national teams have been added, and then there are now also 6 regional/continental all-star teams, for when you want to only play with the best, or perhaps need a really good team to help out someone who might not be so great at FIFA. I of course think having more teams is better, but is it worth replacing your existing copy of the game? Well, probably not, unless you're from one of the 10 countries that got added to the game. One thing that struck me as odd though, when going through and looking at all the teams, each team is ranked in 6 categories: shooting, running, passing, defense, tackling, goalies, and then there's also an overall team average rating at the bottom, with each category being ranked from 1 to 10. Not the most unusual thing in the world, and certainly helpful for when you want to try to pick out a team to play as. But what did strike me as odd is that none of the teams rank 10 in any category, not even the all-star teams. So it kind of begs the question, why have the scale go up to 10 if it's not going to be used? And I know it's not exactly the same thing, but to borrow a line from Spinal Tap, why wouldn't you just make everyone's rank 1 higher? It's the most minor of minor trivialities to be sure, but it just seems weird when you're scrolling through all the teams. And what I'm going to put in the category of minor updates, the back of the box also advertises that the computer player has been refined to make a more competitive game when playing against the CPU. And maybe that's true? I suppose I'd have to play each version one right after the other to try to compare though, because in my experience, the game really didn't play much differently, and I was still able to win pretty easily when playing against teams that were either at my level or below. But when playing a better team, you were definitely in for a fight. The Sega CD version doesn't have difficulty levels, just like the Genesis version, so really your only option if the game is proving too easy is to play more difficult teams, and then vice versa if you're getting your ass kicked. Perhaps that is slightly pronounced from the previous game, because, silly me, I decided to play the game that it defaulted to when you start things up, with the United States versus England, and, well, let's just say things did not go well for the United States. It was actually pretty realistic to watching the national team play. Every now and then there'd be a spark, a run, or a nice shot, but ultimately, everyone knew what the result was going to be. Sigh. Another update that might be hard to tell was implemented is apparently the game features improved player animations. And maybe it does? I don't know, it still pretty much looks like FIFA to me. I suppose it's possible that either the game engine was refined a bit, or that maybe there were a few extra frames added here or there, but certainly not to the point that I could tell. Again, maybe if you had them up side by side for a direct comparison, you could tell, but this is definitely in the category of updates that I don't think merit upgrading to this version, especially if you don't already own a Sega CD. The 2 final things advertised as being added to the game are the addition of full motion video sequences and cheat codes that change how the game plays. The full motion video is pretty self-explanatory, and while I'm sure it might have generated a few oohs and ahs in 1994, you know what, I don't think it did. I've definitely seen better FMV on the Sega CD, and while I wouldn't call the FMV here bad, it's also pointless. It's only used either at the beginning of the game, in the intro, or when you're in the middle of the game and you go to see scores from other games, at which point a clip will play before giving you that score. It's supposed to act as sort of a highlight of that other game, and I get what they were going for, but clearly it's just an unrelated stock footage, and totally unnecessary. I guarantee that much like the footage used in Bill Walsh College Football, players will spend at best 1% of their time watching it, and then move back on to the rest of the game. As far as the cheat codes go, they're mildly interesting, and I could see messing around with them if you were bored or if you really wanted to see Qatar upset Germany or something like that, but it should be noted that the same codes were also included in the Super Nintendo version of the game that came out at roughly the same time, so it wasn't like they were unique to the Sega CD version, they just weren't in the Genesis version. Aside from the advertised differences, there is one more difference that I've got to cover, and that is the loading screens. The nightmarish, horrific acid trip loading screens. I really don't know what's going on here, as the loading times in the game actually are not bad. I'd say they're all less than 10 seconds or so. Sure, it's annoying when you need to go into the game menu and change team strategies or formations during a game, because you'll have to load into the menu screen and then load back out when you're done, but honestly, as far as old single-speed CD-ROM loading times go, I've seen much worse. However, I guess EA thought that they needed to put up a loading screen to cover for those brief interludes, which is fine, and I guess would stop someone from thinking that their game is frozen. However, what's not fine is the loading screens that they decided to use. There's a few different ones, so you don't ever know which one you're going to get when you load, which is actually a nice idea, and I applaud that. But the problem is each of the loading screens is a digitized picture from an actual game, and anyone that's seen how the Sega CD handles digitized pictures, with its lack of color palette, probably knows where this is going. But wait, there's more. Each of the digitized pictures has been altered in a way that I can only assume was done so they could perhaps avoid intellectual property or general copyrights. Due to that, the pictures look, well, I don't even know how to describe it. Well, you know what? Actually, maybe I do. So, this one time I went to a St. Patrick's Day party that my friends throw, and surprise, surprise, I may have got kind of drunk. Okay, let me be real. I got real drunk. While I was sitting on the couch sobering up, I was watching American Pie, but not one of the good ones. It was the 7th one, Book of Love, with Bret Michaels from Poison, amongst other people. Anyway, as I was watching the movie, I was so drunk that the picture was constantly fuzzy and blurry, and the colors were never right. That is how I would describe the loading screens in FIFA. Also, just as an aside, I would never recommend watching that movie, but if you were, it's probably best not to be sober. Just saying. Okay, let's get back to the review and avoid any more embarrassing stories, for this week anyway. Most of the rest of the game is exactly the same as the Genesis version, minus some shoehorned ads for Adidas, and at the time their new line of cleats, the Predator. So if you're familiar with the Genesis version, you can probably skip ahead. But for those of you that aren't, we should probably start with what you can do in the game. The game features 4 modes of play: Exhibition, Tournament, Playoffs, and League. Exhibition is pretty self-explanatory, in that it's just a one-on-one matchup between whichever 2 teams you choose. Tournament mode should be referred to as the AKA World Cup, because that's what it is. Pick a team and the computer will pick 23 others at random, with the teams being split into 6 groups of 4 teams, which is what the rules were for the World Cup at the time, as it wouldn't expand to 32 teams until 1998. And when I say the computer picks 23 other teams at random, I do mean random, which is potentially where the Sega CD version of FIFA could actually be hurt by having too many teams. I say this because when I started a tournament on my own, I picked Norway in an attempt to try to choose a decent team, but not one of the best, to try to make things a little more difficult. Well, the computer sure showed me by creating a tournament that excluded Italy, Germany, and the United States, and somehow managed to set up the anti-group of death in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, China, and Hong Kong. If you decide playing a full tournament is too much, Playoffs mode will take you straight to the round of 16 single elimination portion of the tournament. And finally, there's League mode, which is where you can create a league of 8 teams that plays similar to professional leagues, where each team plays each other twice, and whoever has the highest point total via wins and draws wins the championship. While I'm sure you could ask for more, for a first effort from Electronic Arts, I think the game has a decent feature set, with plenty of in-game options for things like type of field, conditions, half-length, and penalties to keep players engaged for a while. One interesting thing that I noticed about the gameplay comes from the game's use of team strategy. Along with choosing the formation that your team will use, you can choose from a few different strategies, focusing on offense or defense. One of those strategies is all-out offense, which calls for your team to fully push up the field to try to pressure the other team into allowing a goal. This works exactly as you would expect. However, if your team this strategy with playing with offsides turned on, the computer is apparently not smart enough to be able to stay on sides. Like, at all. Granted, along with the focus on offense, part of the push-up strategy is to force the other team into offsides calls, but unfortunately FIFA gets a bit ridiculous here, and you'll be seeing offsides calls literally every 30 seconds. Clearly, there's still some work needed here on the AI. As mentioned earlier, the in-game graphics really don't appear to have changed much from the Genesis version, despite what the back of the box says. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, as the game already had solid graphics for the time period. Sometimes there's issues with not being able to see enough of the field at one time, but for the most part, I think the game balances graphics with gameplay very well, especially when compared to some of the other memorable soccer titles of the era. One odd thing I did notice here, though, was that the game seems significantly darker than the Genesis version. I'm inserting a picture here so you can see for yourselves, but of note, especially compare the reds in the US and England flags. And keep in mind, these images were literally captured back to back using the exact same cables, capture cards, settings, and Genesis. The Sega CD version is darker to the point where it almost seems like it has the same issue that Secret of Monkey Island has, where the shadowed versions of the palette were used instead of the normal ones. It doesn't really affect things too much once you start playing, but it was definitely noticeable for me at first, and I just have to wonder why this occurred, as it seems to be a self-inflicted wound by the developers. Sound-wise, the improvement between the two versions is fantastic. Now, I was expecting the sound to be much better, not just because we're dealing with a CD-based game, but also because of the job that EA did on improving the sound in Bill Walsh College Football. The background music sounds great, but what's most important is the crowd noise, which is incredibly lifelike and now has all sorts of chants and other things interspersed with the gameplay. While the graphics may not have changed much, and as mentioned actually might be a bit worse depending on your view of the colors, the sound really makes this feel like a next-generation title and adds what was already an impressive release. FIFA International Soccer for Sega CD is a release that, for the most part, does what you want in a multimedia version of an existing game. It's got more teams, sound that now feels like it's on the cusp of the next hardware generation, and minimal loading times. But unless you're a massive soccer fan, I don't think it was worth purchasing a Sega CD over. And the color palette issue is simply odd. As a result, I'm giving FIFA International Soccer 3 stars, just like the Genesis version. Had the color issue not been present, I think I might have considered giving it that 4th star because the sound is just that good. But as is, there's not enough here for me to bump it up.
Okay, and that's FIFA International Soccer for the Sega CD. Some people might wonder why I'd go through the trouble of reviewing the same game twice, but as we saw today, there were definitely some distinct differences between the two games, even if they might fly under the radar to most people. I was actually surprised that I couldn't find anything on the internet about the darker colors in the Sega CD version. I guess the Secret of Monkey Island is just more well known for that issue. If anyone has any thoughts on that from a technical perspective, definitely let me know and leave a comment down below. Next time on Zilog and Moto, it's another sports game. Well, in name only, unless you consider game shows a sport, which I guess with some shows like American Gladiators, Wipeout, and Holy Moly, it is sometimes. But this game, of course, isn't based on one of those, as thankfully I got American Gladiators out of the way way back in episode 28. That is definitely not one I ever want to touch again, for sure. This one instead, it doesn't pose any danger to me physically, just mentally. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 233. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!